All right, well, thank you. I just want to thank our hosts again and your graces, the bishops. This is the most time I've spent with the largest number of Maronites in my life, and it's certainly been a joy. So I hope that in yesterday's lecture you came away with a sense of the life and the work of Philoxenos, his concerns, both as a bishop and a monastic theologian, and as someone deeply involved in the Christological controversies. I do want to, before we get into today's topic, one question that came up, someone said, could you just, explain again the terminology Miaphysite, Monophysite, Jacobite, Nestorian, Chalcedonian, non-Chalcedonian? This is actually vocabulary that's changed over, I would say, the last 3 decades or so, mainly due, like everything in Syriac studies, to the excellent work of Sebastian Brock. If you really want to read more on these terms and vocabularies, let's see, Father Armando, we actually will only need that in the afternoon. So, yeah, so it's, although maybe people want it now if this one gets too boring. In terms of the vocabulary, there's actually an excellent article by Sebastian Brock called Nestorian, a Lamentable Misnomer. But I would say there's been a move among scholars to try and only use the terms that fit and were used by the communities themselves. Certainly, you Maronites are familiar yourself with the legacy of other people assigning names from the outside. And indeed, sometimes names assigned from the outside can even become names that are accepted even if they were a slur originally. So, for example, Jacobite is a term that historically was used by the opponents of the Syrian Orthodox. But if you go to India today, some Syrian Orthodox there will refer to themselves as Jacobite. In the same way, the term Nestorian is almost never used now, instead to use the term Church of the East for several good reasons. One, Nestorius was, perhaps only at the end of his life even affiliated with the Church of the East. He was a Greek Christian, so it seems a bit odd to call an entire Syriac church Nestorian. But in any case, this was a label by the opponents and not a very informative one. So to bring it back to the one we used a lot yesterday, Miaphysite, versus probably you're more familiar with historically Monophysite. The reason that scholars have switched, and being scholars, being what they are, there's a lot of ink spilled about this. In fact, there's a whole series of debate articles between Sebastian Brock and others. It's like a series of 4 articles you could go read if you want. Is one, it's a matter of grammar. So phusis being a feminine noun in Greek, then mia phusis makes sense grammatically. But more, I would say probably the important aspect is, and it's a little bit hard to bring out in English, that the miaphysis or miaphysite way of expressing one nature is sort of implying the union of natures, while the monophysite label, when historically applied by the opponents, is implying more of a Eutychian position. Eutyches was a monophysite who taught that there was really only a divine nature. The human nature was so inconsequential that it's basically swallowed up like a drop in the ocean or something like that.
Distinction. That is good. Very good distinction. Thank you.
So that's why scholars today, for the most part, will say miaphysite for what those of you who are familiar with monophysite is the former term. And it mainly has to just do with using terms that the communities themselves would apply to themselves, which I think is a general polite concept to do in the main. So anyway, that's a brief aside. It does mean that things can get a little bit confusing in 2 regards. If one says non-Chalcedonian, of course there are lots of non-Chalcedonians. The Church of the East and the Syrian Orthodox Church are both non-Chalcedonian, but that doesn't mean they agree on their Christology. Let's see, I just dropped my pen, excuse me. And then in the same way, Diophysite or a two-nature Christology. The Church of the East has a non-Chalcedonian two-nature Christology, whereas, of course, Chalcedonian churches also have a two-nature Christology and would be called Diophysite, but it's a different two-nature Christology.
Could you elaborate on the difference between the two?
Well, I would say in the Church of the East, the emphasis is put more heavily on the distinction. So, Philoxenos probably wouldn't necessarily like me to say this, but the Chalcedonian position is a sort of moderate position trying to bring together to some degree, the competing views of, are we putting an emphasis on distinction or are we putting an emphasis on union? To the degree which any of these Christological expressions are successful, perhaps remains in the eye of the beholder. And as Father Bajani pointed out to us several times, the limits of concepts come into play. Is that helpful? Any other questions on those sort of labels? I'm happy to just clarify that further. Even when I have like an hour with my students and they're required to be there for a grade, it's still a complicated thing. And in fact, the Syriac churches themselves, because they are divided over Christology and then also often divided again over who they're in communion with. So, for example, you have West Syrians who are in communion with Rome or not in communion with Rome, etc. There really is a wide range. I'm not sure at this precise moment how many different Syriac communions there are, but something like close to 10, I think. So that's a little bit on vocabulary. Let's go back to Philoxenos. In this morning's lecture, I want to now put Philoxenos in a much broader historical scope for you. That is to sort of show you what we looked at in detail with Philoxenos yesterday, how that's part of a centuries-long development of contemplative theology among the Syriac churches. So my goals here are three. First, I want to introduce you to sort of Philoxenos' legacy. So we're not so much looking directly at Philoxenos today as sort of how his later reputation grew or where his anti-speculative method of reading and contemplation, how it grew and where it ended up. So that's the first goal, his legacy and reputation. Second, I want to go into more detail about the tradition of Syriac Evagrianism that we were discussing yesterday. I think some of you caught a glimpse in the questions that there's a lot of things that are complex about it. We won't go into all those details, but just to give you more of a sense of how Evagrius' reputation and legacy changed over time. And then lastly, I really want to the third point is one I hope that you will reflect on or let me know what you think of, is I want to raise the possibility that this Syriac Evagrianism, of which Philoxenos plays an important formative part, represents a sort of Syriac ecumenism. So it's not exactly that Philoxenos is an ecumenically minded, but whether he liked it or not, he created a tradition that transcended the boundaries of the different Syriac communities, and thus you, as the Maronite Church, are also an heir and participant in this heritage. And in this heritage of Syriac Evagrianism, saints and authors of this contemplative style were able to transcend confessional boundaries, which divided the Syriac churches. So I'm curious to hear from you how perhaps your unique Maronite perspective on communion between different churches might enable you to think about the future of this legacy. So the fact that there was this moment post-Chalcedon where there's theological exchange, the exchange of ideas and types of monasticism, may have some benefit in the future for the shared spirituality of the Syriac churches, East and West. So we'll proceed as follows. First, we'll discuss the development of the Evagrian tradition in Syriac. Second, we'll look at Philoxenos' role. And lastly, we'll conclude by thinking about the ecumenical nature of this Syriac Evagrianism. Let's start with the Evagrian tradition itself. I do want to really emphasize a distinction here. We're going to be focusing on Evagrius as read by Philoxenos and the later tradition, not on Evagrius himself, which might actually be different. Next year, Professor Robin Young can help you understand Evagrius himself. What I want to do now is help you understand what became of Evagrius in the Syriac tradition, which is not the same thing. In scholarly terms, our aim is to understand how Evagrian theology was reinterpreted in light of pre-existing Syriac vocabulary, concepts, and traditions, especially those coming from the Syriac monastic tradition. Yesterday, we examined how Evagrian epistemology shaped Philoxenos' approach to reading scripture. Today, I want to show you how these Evagrian reading practices became an essential part of Syriac monasticism. In my most recent book, The Library of Paradise, I argue that among Evagrius' many legacies, one is that his works became the anchor for a sort of Syriac Lectio Divina, or more properly, if we're going to use the labels from within the traditions, a form of contemplative reading practiced by Syriac monks east and west. In their adapted Syriac form, Evagrius' works provided the structure for ascetic practice in three ways. So the works of Evagrius were themselves ascetic reading material. So a monk might read Evagrius. Two, Evagrius provided a map of spiritual progress. You got a little bit of a sense of that yesterday. And so not only is the monk reading Evagrius, the monk is also thinking about what they're reading and how they're reading in Evagrian terms. And then actually Evagrius texts are sort of self-teaching in that they often model styles of reading even within the text. It's like you're looking over Evagrius' shoulder and watching Evagrius read the Psalms. Evagrius had been trained as a scribe and actually appears to have been pretty fussy about the layout of his works. There's actually instructions about how they should look on the page, etc. And so he even in one of the works comes up with a sort of complicated coding system so that you can quickly navigate to the passage that you want to find. So it's clear he's thinking about the book physically as the monk is reading it. So let's talk about each of these in greater detail. The Evagrian theology shaped the tradition of contemplative ascetic reading because texts by and about Evagrius were widely popular with monastic readers in both the West and East Syrian churches. Syriac readers knew Evagrius through reading three types of literature: hagiography about Evagrius, so saints' lives, Syriac translations of Evagrius' work, and then the use of Evagrius by theologians such as Philoxenos in the West or later Babai in the East. It is important to know that in the medieval period, today, if you wanted to know Evagrius, you might sit down and read a whole work by Evagrius. But in the medieval period, partly due to, accessibility of books, it might be just as likely that you would read some excerpts and a commentary on Evagrius. Or maybe you might just read through Philoxenos, and by the time you're done, the number of quotations from Evagrius have added up to something substantial. So through all of these types of reading, Syriac monks came to highly regard Evagrius as a teacher of ascetic reading and contemplation. The popularity of Evagrian literature led to this second Evagrian influence on Syriac ascetic reading. The Evagrian map of spiritual progress in divine knowledge was widely popular. This map offered a framework within which to understand what's going on in contemplative reading. In other words, reading is actually a step in ascesis. It's not just a means of gaining information. Like fasting, like praying, reading is something that the monk does. So it's important to note, however, that this version of the Evagrian map, as received in Syriac, also incorporated major changes. So Evagrius himself would have probably disagreed with what the Syriac traditions called Evagrianism. And in Syriac version of Evagrianism, the goal of the Evagrian system of spiritual progress was divine vision, or contemplation of the Trinity, and ascetic reading was an essential step, though a penultimate step. All of these authors really make it clear that at a certain point, you put the book down. In fact, at some point I like to go through and collect all these quotations. A really common refrain to a beginning monk is to say, okay, if you're reciting the Psalms, and the presence of God comes over you, don't stop and say, wait, how many Psalms did I have left to recite? You've missed the whole point of reciting the Psalms if you do that. So, the third influence of the works of Evagrius was that they were not merely material for contemplative reading, but as I said, they embodied and modeled a variety of ascetic reading practices, including what in Greek is called anti-retical reading. This is sort of reading against. It's very similar, in fact, to Philoxenos' anti-commentaries. We'll come back to this anti-reading, anti-retical reading. Psalmody, as I just mentioned, and other forms of contemplative reading. Again, reading whose purpose is not to gain the meaning of the text, but in effect to allow the reader to enter into the spiritual text, the spiritual world that the text is a door for. So Philoxenos, as we saw yesterday, taught and promoted these practices and taught monastic readers both how to read Evagrius and how to read in an Evagrian manner. In other words, as a necessary, but as I said again, limited step toward divine vision found in theoria. Theoria is this Greek word for contemplation. It's where we get our English word theory, but that really doesn't do justice to it. And in Syriac, really, the Greek word is just brought over as a loan word. When they want to use a Syriac form of theoria, they'll say divine vision or vision. But often, most commonly in the Syriac Evagrian works, you just see the Greek word theoria written in Syriac. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Evagrius himself. He was originally from Asia Minor. He was an archdeacon and then a monk. He lived from 345 to 399, so roughly a century before Philoxenos. He was highly educated. In fact, in the Apothegmata, the editor actually has an aside in which the other brothers point out that Evagrius' learning is not helpful. He was a very ambitious member of the Constantinopolitan clergy under Gregory of Nazianzus until a moral downfall led him to renounce the world and flee to the Egyptian desert, where he became a prolific ascetic author. Based in Nitria and then Chalia, Evagrius became a disciple of both Macarius the Great and Macarius of Alexandria. And these are the figures whom later Syriac tradition associated with what we now call the Pseudo-Macarian or Simeon letters and homilies. So although today we distinguish those materials from the Macarii of Egypt, in the time period I'm talking about, for a Syriac reader, then they would have viewed Evagrius as being a disciple of the author of the Pseudo-Macarian material. So that helps you see again how these things are all sort of fitting together in the monastic world. Evagrius wrote prodigiously in Greek, and his theology became a target in two major controversies, which were ostensibly about the early 3rd century Greek father Origen of Alexandria. That's the so-called anthropomorphite controversy of the 390s, and the second Origenist controversy of the 6th century. A lot of scholars, I think, have convincingly argued that the so-called anti-Origen controversies are really just about Evagrius, not so much about Origen himself, especially the second one. And so Evagrius was condemned alongside Origen by the Chalcedonian Church at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, and this condemnation led to the suppression of Evagrius' works in Greek. But Evagrius' influence on Greek theology then was severely but not completely curtailed by his condemnation in the Byzantine Church. However, by this point, 553, neither the Syrian Orthodox Church nor the Church of the East were in communion with Constantinople anymore. So the condemnation did not lessen Evagrius' reputation among Syriac ascetics. Already Philoxenos would have written extensively by this point, so Evagrius was well situated in the Syrian Orthodox Church and seems to be similarly situated in the Church of the East at that time. In fact, it may be the case, we can see some Syriac authors doing this, arguing that the condemnation of Evagrius by the Chalcedonian Church in Constantinople was actually to be expected from such, quote, heretics, and perhaps then a sign of Evagrius' true orthodoxy. So in a way, the condemnation of Evagrius may have even heightened his reception. Please see that I'm putting in quotes here, not calling anyone heretics myself. So in the Syriac milieu, Evagrius enjoyed a different legacy and even took on a sort of different legendary persona, if you will, than he had in the West. Details of Evagrius' life and reputation were known through 6th and 7th century Mesopotamia through reading monastic hagiography, especially the life of Evagrius included in Palladius' Syriac history, probably written in the 420s. The ways in which Evagrius was received in Syriac monastic literature has been excellently summarized both in English by Columba Stewart and in French by Paul Géant. So if you're really interested in this, in fact, Robin Darling Young has edited a volume with an essay by Father Columba on the legacy and reception of Evagrius in Syriac. So if this really catches your interest, there's a lot of good recent work you can read. In particular, Stewart notes that Evagrius' reputation was enhanced by the fact that works by and about Evagrius were often amended, bolstered, or augmented in the process of Syriac translation. And Géant says that in Syriac, Evagrius was actually lionized or praised as, quote, one of the most eminent, indeed paradigmatic representatives of Egyptian monasticism. So while in the West, in Greek, say, or in Latin, Evagrius is just sort of a named theologian, right? You have Basil of Caesarea, you have Evagrius, you have Athanasius. They're all theologians, each having their own particular emphasis. But in Syriac, Evagrius is really just viewed as, oh, that's the systematic expression of what the monks were doing in Egypt. So the Syriac attachment to Evagrius is not about Evagrius himself, so much as in Syriac, that's where the ascetic philosophies of the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers got worked out. So to say Evagrius could just be to say the Egyptian tradition of, Scetis, Kelea, etc. The main hagiographical accounts of Evagrius available in Syriac were translations from Palladius, and they're pretty early. The earliest Syriac manuscript of the life of Evagrius is British Library 12175, which is a West Syrian manuscript with an actual date on it. Praise God for the scribes who thought to put a date on their manuscripts. In fact, you may not be aware of this, but one of the gems of the Syriac tradition is that the Syriac tradition has the earliest dated Bible manuscript. Now, I don't mean the earliest Bible manuscript. There's a fragment, little scrap of John that may be, from within 50 years of John's gospel. What I mean is, it was the Syriac tradition where a scribe first thought, I will write the date of when I made this manuscript on a Bible manuscript. Now, it took to the 400s to do it, so, they needed 400 years after Jesus to come up with the idea of writing the date for us historians. But anyway, I'm grateful for that. So, this manuscript is from 434, so it's only 1 decade after the death of Philoxenos, and it doesn't appear to be the first translation. So, certainly even Philoxenos would have known of Palladius' history in Syriac. Maybe his scriptorium translated it. Who knows? In this manuscript, it's a West Syrian one, Syrian Orthodox, the life of Evagrius is titled as a triumph, neshono. So this is a word which in other hagiographies describes martyrdom. So you can see already the very high level that the life of Evagrius is being described as. The prestige of the text is further burnished and polished by the fact that actually Basil of Caesarea is anachronistically listed as the author instead of Palladius. This is often a sort of way that scribes might respond to a text. If it's particularly impressive, well, then it must have been written by, a top shelf person like Basil. So anyway, this manuscript, for our purposes, it's important to note, is part of a series of 14 Syriac manuscripts from the 6th century, which either contain Palladius' life of Evagrius or are actually thematically organized around Evagrius. 6 of these manuscripts, the whole contents of the manuscript is about Evagrius, by Evagrius, commenting on Evagrius. So, in the century after Philoxenos, there must have been, this is sort of an Oprah's bestseller list, I guess, for the Syriac world. Give us the cliff notes of Evagrius, if you will. Most of these manuscripts are West Syrian in origin. Thank you, Dair al-Surian, for preserving them. But probably they were represented more widely. There's definitely some evidence that the hagiography of Evagrius was read in mid-6th century Mesopotamia also by East Syrian communities and was growing rapidly in popularity. By the late 7th century, Palladius' work, including the sections on Evagrius, were collected and reissued with other ascetic works in a compendium called the Paradise by Enonisho of Adiabene, an East Syrian monk. This collection, the Paradise, soon became the sort of authoritative collection of monastic lives and monastic sayings, not only in the Church of the East, but across the Syriac world. Enonisho's Paradise, we have copies that survive in Sogdian from China. We have Melkite copies in Arabic from St. Catherine's, and eventually we'll get to it ends up in Ethiopic as well. So by the 7th century, all of this Evagrian material is available both East and West Syriac traditions. And it's consumed by monastic readers who placed Evagrius alongside Basil of Caesarea, Isaiah of Scetis, and Macarius the Great as one of the founders or expressors of Egyptian monasticism. So let's look a little bit about what these Evagrian texts look like. This is often called the common version, or in the technical apparatus of scholars, the S1 version. I find this is a little bit confusing. S1 stands for Syriac version 1. If you encounter this in the scholarly literature, when it says S1, you can just think, okay, the common Syriac version of Evagrius. The strong demand for Syriac readers had a parallel in an explosion of interest in actually reading the works of Evagrius. A large portion of Evagrius' corpus was translated into Syriac. In fact, today, and this is one of my arguments for understanding Syriac Evagrianism as a sort of ecumenical moment, is that more of Evagrius' works survive in Syriac than they do in Greek today. So in many ways, Evagrius, becomes part of the Syriac tradition. Maybe not the Evagrius who wrote originally, but this idealized Evagrius. And some of his works saw multiple translations into Syriac. Moreover, Evagrius' authority as an ascetic teacher was such that his name also began to get attached to other texts. Remember how I just mentioned once someone has a distinguished reputation, then their name gets started attached to things that they didn't write. Monastic readers in the 5th to 7th century thus had a lot of Evagrius they could choose from to read as they wanted to learn to contemplate or to contemplate. To understand how this Evagrian corpus was read, we need to look at the works of Evagrius and how they were translated and transmitted into Syriac. The Syriac common version offers an insight into the ascetic goals of these monastic readers. The things they chose to copy and the things that they chose not to copy tells us what they were interested in and what their values were. So in other words, while this is about Evagrius, it's as much about the Syriac ascetics who were picking and choosing what was actually valuable to them in their monastic vocation. It's not clear when Evagrius' works were first translated. As I mentioned yesterday, the earliest evidence for the Syriac translation of Evagrius are all those citations in Philoxenos, some of which you read yesterday. The best evidence for wide dissemination is one of those 14 manuscripts I just mentioned, British Library 14578. It contains 48 Evagrian texts in Syriac. Now, 48 should be in quotation marks, because not all of them are actually by Evagrius, but it's a manuscript that says, here are 48 texts by Evagrius. Paul Jan has studied this manuscript extensively, and he notes that this probably represents an advanced stage of collecting the works of Evagrius. So to get to this point in the 6th century where you have 48 different Evagrian things in the same manuscript, he argues that probably the process started in the early 400s or the 450s at least, so that you can get to the point where all of these things are collected. So in other words, it's exactly during the lifetime of Philoxenos that the Syriac tradition begins to get deeply invested in Evagrius. Now, it is important to note that the Syriac common version differs from the Greek originals in ways that, as I said, are clues to how Evagrius was read in Syriac. In fact, we can kind of divide his works into 4 categories based on how they're received. The first category is the easiest one. works that were never translated into Syriac from the Greek. These are, interestingly, mainly the things that Philoxenos would not have found interesting: scholia and traditional biblical commentaries. As far as I can tell, very little of Evagrius's numerology, for example, makes it into Syriac. So there are some works that never made it into Syriac. A second category of Evagrian texts are works which in Syriac were attributed to Evagrius, but are actually by other authors. One example would be two works by Abraham of Nathpar, an East Syrian author, that are attributed to Evagrius. In that same manuscript I just mentioned, there are at least 8 works that are attributed to Evagrius, but not actually by him. As Columbus Stewart notes, the Syriac tradition was, quote, overly generous in attributing writings to Evagrius. So Syriac ascetic readers were strongly interested in reading the works of Evagrius, and that prestige began to attach other texts as well. But why? Well, because they're useful for the same kind of contemplation. Obviously, it doesn't work to take the name of Evagrius and slap it onto a text that doesn't sound like Evagrius, that's not useful for the same reasons. So it's clear for these Syriac readers that Evagrius is resonating styles of how to read scripture, how to pray, that fit with other texts in the Syriac tradition. A third category of Evagrian works are texts which survive in Syriac and might be described as, quote, authentic, or at least seem to be very similar to the Greek original. There's something we can learn from this. You might say, okay, they just translated them successfully. Yes, but what were they interested in translating without changing? The fact here is that it includes nearly all of Evagrius' ascetic advice manuals. So anything that you could sort of hand to a novice or an intermediate contemplative or solitary, they basically just take intact. That's what they're interested in. It's the more advanced and speculative works, the longer ones, that get ignored or adapted. In fact, Jean and Stewart have noticed that the Syriac tradition of Evagrius tended to favor short chapter works rather than the long works. And this might be because Evagrius actually specialized in writing very short chapters, sometimes 2 sentences, 3 sentences. And you can imagine that then the monk takes that, whatever that particular chapter is, and you can sit in your cell with it. So it's these very short, useful, practical works, again, fitting with what we've seen in Philoxenos of a practical approach to contemplation. Finally, we can identify a fourth group, the texts in which the Syriac versions diverge extensively or even radically from Evagrius' original Greek. These amended or edited texts often survive in multiple translations and show evidence of theological changes to the original text. The earliest and dominant branches are what are usually called the common version in Syriac. And as I said, since there are multiple versions, sometimes they're called S1, S2, S3. Generally speaking, if you're reading in the literature and you see it says S1, that means this changed Syriac common version. Scholars, because we're interested in getting back to the original truth, whatever that may be, have, I think, unfortunately focused too heavily on the S2 and S3 versions. We want to get back to what did Evagrius actually write, which has meant, for the most part, scholars have ignored what did the Syrian Orthodox, what did the Church of the East actually want to read. You see sort of the difference here. If you read my book, I have a whole chapter in which I explain some of the reasons that can unfortunately be attributed to Western colonialism, the reasons that Syriac manuscripts were collected and taken from the Middle East, etc. Western scholars were typically dominated by their own interests, which were not identical to the interests of what a monk in the Middle Ages was actually doing with the text. Anyway, that could be another lecture, or happy to refer you to the chapter in my book on that. So, the altered versions of Evagrius most affected how Syriac readers interpreted Evagrius' magnum opus. Evagrius wrote a 3-part work, a trilogy, which in Greek is called the Praktikos, the Logos Praktikos, the practical word, the Gnostikos, the knower, and the Kephalaia Gnostica, the Gnostic chapters. So this 3-part work is the most famous. If you've read Evagrius, likely you've probably read the Practicos, even today the most well-known. The Kephalaia Gnostica is definitely very deep and difficult to get through. And I guess I'm getting paid for a living to read it and say that. These three works circulated in Syriac, but with changes that fit the interests and sensibilities of Syriac ascetic readers. The S1 versions, or the common version, created a Syracized Evagrian theology, which had harmonized with the Syriac anti-speculative tradition of Ephrem and Philoxenos. The purpose of the redaction was to preserve the ascetic system which could be gleaned from Evagrius, while at the same time discouraging the sort of theological speculation about human knowledge of God, the eschaton, the end times, found in Evagrius and associated with Origenism. So you remember we spoke briefly about apokatastasis, this doctrine of the redemption of all things, which Philoxenos thought rats and snakes disproved. Evagrius also seems to teach a double creation and a double fall and a double redemption. The Syriac tradition is confused by that because, of course, that doesn't appear in the biblical text. So that part is actually removed as well. So much of this sort of what in theological and philosophical terms we might call the cosmology, these sort of esoteric elements of Evagrius are removed in the Syriac version. With its speculative cosmology removed, Syriac readers valued Evagrius' trilogy primarily as a practical ascetic manual for teaching discipline and contemplation. The same values are also seen in the fact that in the Syriac translation, the trilogy circulated differently. So when Evagrius wrote it, there are three works, and they sort of proceed from easiest to most complex. In the Syriac tradition, the most complex one circulates the least, sometimes not at all, and the other two circulate as a co-joined work. So just one practical work with these very short chapters. I think in the Practicos and the Gnosticos, the longest chapter can't be more than 15 lines or something like that. So generally very short chapters. So for Evagrius, asceticism was an ascent towards essential knowledge of God. And William Harmless has convincingly described Evagrius as a mystical map maker, in that Evagrius sought to chart out how the contemplative arrived at mystical knowledge through three different steps. But already you can see in the Syriac tradition, the three steps are kind of getting fudged into two steps, and it's really only the first step that the monks seem to be interested in. Let me pause there. I want to take a drink here and just see if there's any questions so far. I've sort of given you the overview, and we'll get into the theology in a minute.
My question is a bit logistical, so I don't know how much information you have about that, but you mentioned the importance of reading for monks and the influence of reading Evagrius in monastic circles. I'm considering in the 4th, 5th century, education was still not prevalent, and considering that these were monks, not clerics, so are we saying that a lot of the monks actually came from educated circles, or are we saying that learning how to read and write became part of their training, or are we imagining that, for example, there'd be one or two who could read and write, and they would read it to the rest of the monks to educate them? How do you imagine that happened? Do we know? Do we speculate?
So yes, I've got a whole chapter in my book on that.
You just want me to buy the book, don't you?
That's right. No, I don't. No, to my deep regret, the book is priced such that only academic libraries can afford it. So there's some really interesting things there. One, I think it's generally true, even in Greek monasticism, that certainly when one becomes a monk, regardless of sort of what today we might call socioeconomic background, one could learn to read, likely through copying out a copy of the Psalter for oneself. So yes, in the ancient world, probably 5% or less of the population is literate, but monasticism does seem to have a higher rate of literacy, or at least what we might call oral literacy, right? So maybe not an ability to read the text, but an ability to memorize the text. then the Syriac traditions themselves do have a high level of monastic education. So I mentioned the school of Edessa before. This school, and then later school of Nisibis, etc. There's a long tradition of schools as a precursor to monasticism. So if you look at some of the East Syrian texts, are the ones I'm more familiar with, the monastic histories there, such as the Book of the Founders, which now is maybe getting redated, but in any case, there's a kind of a curriculum where one attends a beginning school, just to put all of us to shame, probably as a 10 or 12-year-old is when one is doing this, not our high school or college age. But one attends a school before joining a monastery. That becomes the normative pattern in the Church of the East in this period. Maybe not, the majority, but certainly a normative pattern that a hagiography would describe happening. Interestingly, women also play a very important role in literacy, at least in saints' lives. So you have sort of a trope of a mother or an ascetic older sister, training the future monk in literacy at a young age, so then the monk is ready to read when he gets to the monastery. We also have the life of Febronia, which, people haven't always noticed. What is Febronia's chief source of her sanctity? Not to put us on the spot, it's that she's the reader for the community. And in fact, when she's martyred, one of the things that the lament of the women in the community, they say, who will read the scriptures to us? So this does seem to be then, not just male elites who are trained in literacy. It does seem to be that there is a role for a skilled reader. Rabban Bar Ita in the Church of the East is described as filling the banks of the Euphrates with the sweet melody of his reading. So, reading to the whole congregation. In fact, now I'm getting off track here, but it's great. It describes him as having a double blessing in that the monks are spending their time sometimes doing labor and sometimes reading. But since his labor is reading to the community, he gets to read twice, if you see what I mean. It also answered an important question. Okay, now we've got to get back to the lecture here. It answered an important question that I really wanted to answer, which was, how many books were the monks allowed to take out of the library at a time? And for Rabban Bar Ita was just one book. So those of you who have more than one book...
Let's see one more book than you can borrow from the Semetics library at CUA.
There you go. Anyway, so these are terrific questions. It does seem also in the West Syrian case, Philoxenos Scriptorium is also an example of a bishop investing heavily, and also all of these monastic letters means that at least there's a sort of literary network connecting these monastic communities. So somebody there to read them. Great, terrific questions. Any other questions on Evagrius?
Just a real quick one. You were saying about some of the different, for the S1 from the Greek, it was some of the works that they chose, you said that they never translated things like the Scholia or biblical commentaries, or
Right.
less, maybe.
Yeah. I'm not aware of the Scholia being in Syriac at all, though I will, in the second talk this afternoon, show you a terrific database by Joel Kalvasmaki, where you can go and look up everything you'd ever want to know about Evagrius and what language it's in.
So would that indicate that of Philoxenos's influence then on the S1 development of what was chosen and not chosen, or is that very speculative? Since
Not speculative in the negative sense of speculative.
Since he didn't agree with some
Right.
of these
Yeah,
commentaries.
I'm not willing to, say, oh, Philoxenos was the mastermind of all of this, partly because earlier scholarship, so Antoine Guillemot did want to say, oh, Philoxenos must have sponsored all of the S1 translations, and so earlier generations of scholarship saw Philoxenos everywhere. What I would like to say instead is the values of the S1 tradition, anti-speculation, not interested in complex, lexical or word-based commentary. those values are shared between Philoxenos and the S1. Did he influence it? Are they all just part of the same movement or moment in theology? I guess we can't know here on earth.
Yes.
Yeah, great questions. Well, let's then go into the theology of Evagrius a little bit. So, for Evagrius, asceticism was an ascent toward essential knowledge of God, and Evagrius really is this mystical map maker, in the words of Bill Harmless. And Columbus Stewart has noted that this three-part system of spiritual progress toward divine knowledge actually is reflected in the structure of Evagrius's trilogy. So, Practicos, Gnosticos, Kephalaia Gnostica. As I said before, scholars have primarily been interested in recovering the historical Evagrius, unfortunately to the neglect of looking at the S1 translation. The S1 translation does a few interesting things. Some revisions attempt to link Evagrius' threefold path to the three stages of the spiritual life taught by John the Solitary. A second trend, which happens at the same time and is not mutually exclusive, is to blur the second and third stage in Evagrius' map, effectively revising it from a three-stage progression to a two-stage progression that then would reflect, say, the Book of Steps. It's also the case that even in Evagrius' own works, sometimes he talks about 2 stages, sometimes he talks about 3 stages. And I think you saw yesterday that Philoxenos also adopts this 2-stage method. Of Evagrius' 3-part system, the first step was ascetic practice, praktike, polhono in Syriac, so the labor of the monk. And it's really the same in both the Syriac and the Greek original. Through discipline, an aspiring ascetic controls the passions, reaches a state of passionless stillness, and only after the soul and mind have been purified is the ascetic capable of true love for God and pursuit of true knowledge of God. The Evagrian apatheia is expressed in the Syriac translations through vocabulary of stillness, shelia, or purity, dakyutho. These concepts are also found in John the Solitary, Pseudo-Macarius, and for the most part, Syriac readers really just thought that these other authors and Evagrius are all talking of roughly the same process. In Syriac Evagrianism, it's at the second and third step, the pursuit of knowledge, where the Syriac system becomes hazier than Evagrius' original. In the Greek original, Evagrius distinguished sharply between contemplation focused on natural knowledge, theoria physicae, as the second step, and then contemplation of divine knowledge, theologia, as the third step, so contemplating the Trinity. It's one thing to learn about God from contemplating the created world. It's another thing to contemplate the mystery of the Trinity. This distinction doesn't exactly disappear in Syriac, but it's not emphasized. It seems that for the Syriac tradition, the important distinction came between step 1, where you're doing the ascetic practice, and step 2, where you have sort of moved beyond practice to stillness and contemplation in the mind. So for Syriac readers of Evagrius, theoria was more than just interpretation or thinking. Pursuit of theoria can take as its reading material not only scripture, but all of creation. So this subject of contemplation is what can be known about God through the created world, observing nature, through God's providence, medabronutho, through the incarnation, through God's revelation in Scripture. In short, the Evagrian contemplation in the Syriac version is sort of condensed to all kinds of contemplation. So, having surveyed the itinerary of spiritual progress, which undergirded Syriac Evagrianism, we can now pinpoint the location of ascetic reading on that map. Ascetic reading sits at the midpoint where the monk moves from bodily physical practice to contemplation. And it makes sense because reading is both a physical practice, right? You're using the eyes to process letters. You're possibly holding a book. You're listening if you're not holding a book. So it's a bodily practice. And yet it's also a spiritual mental practice. So it fits that it should come right in between the bodily practice and the contemplation. So let's look at what Evagrius taught about reading. because the works of Evagrius were not merely reading material, they embodied and modeled a variety of ascetic reading practices. The first is what we can call anti-rhetoric reading. In one memorable passage in his On the Eight Thoughts, Evagrius offered this description of a monk trying to read, but beset by achadia, or listlessness, an occurrence that must have been quite common for monastic readers. If you're bored by my talk, you'll enjoy this quote. And the one with achadia, when he reads a book, he yawns much, and is battered by sleep, and rubs his eyes, and stretches, and when he raises his eye from the book, he looks at the ceiling, and then he returns to read a little. He closes the book, and again he opens the book, and he counts how many quires it has. He's like counting the sewing and the binding of the book, and how many lines it has. And when he is vanquished by sleep, he puts the book over his head, and he lies down. That's not the punchline.
Oh.
And just as he begins to sink into sleep, he is awoken by his hunger. So, for Evagrius, you can see this is the monk trying to read, but hasn't fully defeated the passions, and the role that reading could play in this context. This passage, by the way, gets, I'm aware of, I think, at least 3 different Syriac works that quote or refer to this passage. I mean, even as a professor, not a monk, I could definitely relate to it. Anyway, the anti-retical reading is a common theme in Evagrius. There's a Greek work called the Anti-Reticos. The modern translator, David Brockie, has translated the word anti-reticos as talking back. In other words, talking back to the demons or the temptations. In the Syriac, the title is this one I've just read, On the Eight Thoughts. And it explains how you use reading to combat each of the 8 thoughts that might encounter the monk or try to distract the monk from contemplation. And it really implies a form of refutation or rebuttal from reading. Luke Deisinger has summarized how this works. In the practice of antiresis, select biblical verses are employed to counteract particular logismi, tempting thoughts, against which the monk is struggling. Antiresis entails the employment of biblical texts not only against the demons and their thoughts, but also against sinful tendencies within the self, and even more broadly as refutations of a particular group of people or a form of behavior. Finally, antiresis also includes the offering to God of successful biblical prayers. So the monk in this situation is to take the text of Scripture and make it the monk's own words. In other words, the Scripture provides what the monk needs to counter the temptation. So for Evagrius, the Psalms especially served as both spiritual remedy and spiritual weapon. But that's not the only use of the Psalms. The Psalms also serve this intermediary role between physical practice and contemplation. So anti-retical reading, really, you're still at this level of fighting the passions. But the Psalms also take you in another direction. Deisinger continues, for those who are making spiritual progress, the practice of psalmody is more than just a means of calming the passions or contradicting the demons. Evagrius believed the book of Psalms afforded a vision of the whole of creation, including the daily struggles of the monastic practice, but also refulgent, full with divine meaning. The Psalter can serve as a training ground for the Christian contemplative, a kind of a workshop in which the Gnostikos learns to perceive the divine words and the events of salvation as they're recounted in the book of Psalms. Evagrius positions the book of Psalms at the midpoint of a movement between ascetic toil and contemplative knowledge. So like anti-retical psalmody, this contemplative psalmody is focused on the text of Scripture, but as an aid to knowledge of God rather than deterring demonic assault. As Evagrius explains in his own work, the knower, the contemplative monk, needs to have already mastered the passions. This kind of psalmody reflects a higher stage in the Evagrian model of spiritual progress. So, this brings us then to the level of contemplation. In the Syriac tradition's modified map of Evagrian spiritual progress, the culmination was theoria, contemplation of the Trinity, described as spiritual vision or ineffable light. Of particular note here is the fact that for Evagrius, theoria was not just an interpretation, not the meaning of Scripture. It is interesting, Theodore of Mopsuestia uses theoria to simply mean interpretation. But for Evagrius, it's something much more. And in fact, the Syriac translators are reluctant to say what it is, which of course fits with what we've seen in Philoxenos. You can't actually put the result of the contemplation into words. You can just say that it happens. So often the S1 translators will talk about contemplation in terms of faith, haimonutho, rather than knowledge. So the result of contemplation is faith, not knowledge in the Syriac version. So in this sense, the contemplation of Scripture for Syriac Evagrian readers is less about drawing knowledge out of the biblical text and more about the contemplative reader entering in by faith into the divine reality for which the text is a door. Now, let's turn briefly to Philoxenos. Hopefully, everything I'm saying now resonates with what you've heard in Philoxenos yesterday. But I want to mention a few things. One, someone asked, does Philoxenos ever mention Evagrius by name? And it is the case that actually he only mentions Evagrius by name once. And in that case, he's actually condemning a monk for being involved in extreme Evagrianism. So it's really clear that for Philoxenos, two things are going on. One, it's not Evagrius himself that's important. It's that this is a clear expression of the contemplative theology. And two, it may well be that Philoxenos doesn't want to name Evagrius because that would give his Chalcedonian opponents one more reason to attack him. So Philoxenos is interested in the tradition, not so much, a sort of slavish following of Evagrius. He values Evagrius not because of the authority of the author, but from the fact that it eloquently epitomizes and summarizes a number of early Christian views concerning the nature of ascetic life. He often pairs his quotes of Evagrius with quotes from the Apothegmata, the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers. So, as we saw yesterday, Philoxenos' use of the S1 or common Evagrian path to divine knowledge is really evident in his biblical commentaries. I'll just refer to you, if you have that handout from yesterday, you could go back and look at quotes 1 and 2 on that handout, where he talks about Evagrian contemplation and then quotes this phrase from Evagrius, the door to the vision of natural knowledge. He says, spiritual love is the door to the vision of natural knowledge, from whence one is transported to divine words and another kind of blessedness. So this another kind of blessedness is as close as Philoxenos is going to get to saying what's going on in theoria. Now, I don't really want to dwell on Philoxenos here because hopefully you already have a sense of where he fits in the picture. You have a sense of the growing interest in Evagrius among all the Syriac churches. So what happens after Philoxenos? In the century after Philoxenos, the number of Evagrian materials available in Syriac explodes, grows exponentially. And the authority of Evagrius in Syriac as an ascetic teacher grows stronger and stronger, not only in West Syrian monasteries, but also in the Church of the East. In fact, the Evagrian style of contemplative reading, which Philoxenos championed, becomes a central part of the 6th century East Syrian monastic reform of Abraham of Kashgar. Abraham dies in the 580s, so roughly 60 years after Philoxenos. Abraham was the abbot of the great monastery on Mount Isla in Upper Mesopotamia, so not that far away from places where you would also find Syrian Orthodox or West Syrian monasteries. And Abraham's reform imitated Egyptian models of monasticism. He was trying to stabilize the Church of the East in this period. It's a very tumultuous period for the Church of the East. And the structured use of ascetic reading was regulated and codified in the various monastic canons associated with Abraham of Kashgar, where Evagrius is frequently designated as Mar Evagrius. So in the Church of the East, they have no hesitation about making it clear that Evagrius sits alongside, especially Basil of Caesarea, for example. Abraham of Kashgar's second successor as abbot of the great monastery is Babai the Great, who dies in 628. And Babai writes extensive commentaries on Evagrius and the S1 or common version. Was Babai aware of Philoxenos' Evagrian ascetic theology? This can only be speculated at, but the evidence is suggestive. Babai certainly knows of Philoxenos, knows of his revision of the New Testament, even at one point quotes some Euthalian materials connected with Philoxenos. So it seems likely that, and we know Babai had access to the same S1 versions that Philoxenos did. So perhaps Babai was aware of Philoxenos' own Evagrian contemplative theology. In any case, we can say that Babai's reinterpretation of Evagrius exemplifies the same reception of Evagrius into Syriac monasticism that we found in Philoxenos' Evagrianism. Like Philoxenos' rejection of speculative theology, Babai's theology represents a separation between the literary culture of the school and the contemplative culture of the monastery. This is actually a pretty big rupture in the Church of the East, which, as I said before, had been known for its school culture. And under Evagrius, the ascetic monastic culture, which grows in rivalry, actually breaks and then surpasses the school culture. There's a lot of fighting between school and monastery in this period for theological authority in the Church of the East. In the generation after Babai, one could argue that Syriac Evagrianism comes into full bloom. Here we see contemplative readers, influenced by Syriac Evagrianism, rejecting forms of scholastic reading as incompatible with the pursuit of divine knowledge. At one point, the Catholicos wants to build a school in one of the main monasteries, and the monks say, if you build the school, we will leave. A monastery is not a place where people should be learning to read. They both know they need to read for their contemplation, but also it will be disruptive to them. In the generation after Babai then, we find full expression of this theology of contemplative Evagrian reading in three mystical authors, Ananisio of Adiabene, Dadisho of Qatar, and Isaac of Nineveh. All three authors simply assume that their readers are familiar with the common Syriac tradition of Evagrian contemplative reading. In other words, by the time we get to Isaac of Nineveh, it's just accepted that this Evagrian theology of contemplation, of reading, is the norm. It's what the monk will be taught. It makes sense of the progression into the solitary life. It's not even really up for debate in a certain sense. When we get a century or two later, it does become sort of more extreme and gets condemned. And you could make an argument that some of the reasons that Isaac of Nineveh ran into trouble could be related to his theology of divine love. But it's pretty clear that everyone accepts the role of contemplation and reading in the monasticism of the Church of the East in this period. So from these works of these ascetic authors, we can fill out our picture of how a Syriac ascetic reading was taught and practiced. The earliest of these authors, Ananisio, compiled what would stand for centuries as the essential text for contemplative reading, the Paradise, an anthology he collected of hagiographic and apothegmatic texts, including Syriac translations of Palladius' Laziac history, Athanasius' Life of Anthony, and the sayings of the Desert Mothers and Fathers. The Paradise really represents the demand among monasteries for Egyptian ascetic reading material. It's kind of like a one-volume library. Going back to you can only take one book out of the library. Well, taking out Ananisio's Paradise is really convenient because it has almost everything you need. It's also a massive book. If you've seen Budge's modern-day edition, it's, two very big volumes. Let's see. The Paradise then expressed this demand for ascetic reading material. Like Babai's commented text of Evagrius, the Paradise itself was designed for contemplative use, and its title reveals the aim. It's a door to paradise through reading and contemplation. Dadisho, who followed Ananisio, designed his own writings to teach contemplative reading, writing a commentary on the Paradise. But even this commentary encouraged ascetic readers to resist forms of inquisitive or speculative reading at odds with Evagrian contemplation. So the commentary is designed to help you read the text simply, not get caught up in words and meanings, etc. Like Philoxenos, Dadisho even railed against Theodore of Mopsuesia's Antiochene exegesis. This is sort of a startling moment, given that Dadisho is a highly respected Church of the East author, and Theodore of Mopsuesia was still the revered commentator of the tradition. But Dadisho successfully argues that Theodore's style is good for schools, but not appropriate to the solitary. Instead, Dadisho championed what he saw to be the form of the reading exclusively fit for solitary ascetics. Similarly, Isaac of Nineveh actually published a reading list or monastic curriculum. Though, like Philoxenos' anti-commentaries, it's really a list of what's prohibited for the monk. Isaac says, quote, "Do not read anything that speaks in a common sort of way, or anything which indiscriminately instructs both you and ordinary people, or the sort that is for use for teaching all ranks of people, or the kind that leads you to acquire verbal disputation and training in the wisdom of this world, or the kind that informs you about the affairs and quarrels that have taken place in the church, or the canons, or the affairs of kings, their victories and histories, or the polemic words and refutations of opposing parties. Let us leave all of this kind of reading to the healthy, whereas we, in our sickness," meaning the monk, "should make use of medicines that are collected together for the healing of our passions."
Wow. We need to take that advice.
There's even a beautiful quote, which I didn't stick in here, but I seem to be riffing more today, that's attributed to Basil. It's the Syriac version of Basil's letter 2, where the Syriac author says to his recipient, "You asked me to send you the refutation of the heretics, and while the refutation of the heretics is a good thing, it's not appropriate for the monk, and so I'm not sending it to you." So you can see that they're really focused on this contemplative, practical reading. Now, we modern scholars were not the only ones to notice how closely the contemplative theology of Philoxenos and Isaac resemble each other. Medieval scribes also noticed and decided that although there might be Christological differences between Philoxenos, Dadisho, or Isaac, the similarity of their contemplative theology might nevertheless render Isaac of Nineveh useful to Chalcedonian monks or Dadisho to Miaphysites, and began to swap texts and sometimes even the names on the texts. Thus, both Isaac of Nineveh and Philoxenos' monastic works end up in Chalcedonian Greek translations, and in the case of Isaac, even appear in the tradition of the Philokalia. Philoxenos' work, his letter to Patricius, when translated for use by Greek monks, ends up having the name of the author changed to Isaac of Nineveh. So Byzantine or Melkite monks are reading a Syrian Orthodox author under the name of an East Syrian author. This is the sort of ecumenism. I don't know what Philoxenos would have thought about that. Maybe he would have been bothered by it. But it's clear that Isaac and Philoxenos are transcending these confessional lines. Another similar swap occurred in the other direction. Dadisho's commentary and Ananisho's Paradise became, as I said, the Syriac bestsellers of the Middle Ages. In fact, I would argue that effectively Dadisho's commentary on the Paradise is the equivalent to the Philokalia, but some 500 years earlier. From 900 to 1400, we can find copies of these East Syrian Evagrian texts translated and added to Sogdian, West Syrian, Melkite, and Ethiopian monastic libraries. In the Ethiopian church, Dadisho's commentary was eventually named one of 3 authoritative texts for monks. The problem is, how do you legitimate an East Syrian text in a Miaphysite church like the Ethiopic church, so that Dadisho's writings, when they reached Ethiopia, were now circulating under the name of Philoxenos. So too, the East Syrian, Joseph Haziah's works, also circulated among the Syrian Orthodox under Philoxenos' name. These were not just crude pseudonyms. It's not like people are just sneaking in texts that don't agree with the theology. The reason the names could be convincingly swapped and used across confessional lines was because their Evagrian contemplative theologies were so similar. So to conclude, one could go on with more shared examples. See my book. Such as this letter I mentioned, the Syriac supplement to Basil's letter 2 was just pointed out to me by Matteo Poiani as I was finishing the book, enough that I could get that good quote about not sending the refutation of the heretics in, but not enough to actually track it down. Someone should translate and edit that text. The important thing is to note is that in the period 600 to 1200, let's say, so well after the Christological divisions of Chalcedon had hardened and were, really boundaries that were important markers, nevertheless, the shared unity of the Syriac churches occurred through a number of Evagrian authors and texts: Philoxenos, Abraham of Nathpar, Ananisho, Dadisho, Isaac, Joseph Haziah. And these authors still managed to become ecumenical authorities, and sometimes, as in the case of Isaac, even under the author's own name. That's really the astounding thing about Isaac, is Isaac the Syrian is accepted as authoritative across all of the Christological communions, for example. So this brings us to our period of discussion. I really want to say I'm very excited to be among you as Maronites here, because you have your own unique perspective and history on what confessional lines mean or don't have to mean, and how permeable or not permeable they might be. And as Father Vejani has really shown, you, of course, are part of this tradition of Syriac spirituality, even if your own history is in a particular time and place. This history of the shared traditions of Isaac of Nineveh are also part of your spiritual heritage and theology. So thank you, and I really look forward to your questions and thoughts. Yes, please, Your Grace.
Thank you for this wonderful 2 days. So as you know, the Maronite Church is kind of unique. It's a monastic movement that became a church. Monasticism is known for its conservative style of, like Benedictine monasticism, that evangelized the West. The Maronite evangelism, and Maronite monasticism evangelized the Middle East with many monasteries. We are West Syriac, but also East Syriac. Even some of our liturgical tradition is East Syriac, just as well as West Syriac. So we've got both East and West. With knowing that, and now with your beautiful conclusion, I put that out to you just for comment.
Well, I would say, yesterday, a question that came up, informally, people asking, and you even raised it in our discussion, was, okay, if further agreement were to come among the different Syriac churches, what could its basis be? And I would say that, it might actually be a different way to frame it is, there are areas where the agreement already exists. In other words, this monastic idea that even the refutation of the heretics is only secondary to pursuing the love of God and encountering it through contemplation. And that's something, as I said, that's shared across the traditions. So I really think that that's an area where further cooperation, collaboration, even encouragement between the Syriac churches could happen, this shared monastic heritage.
I'm thinking, Professor, of a quote I remember, Rabban Isho, who was told of the glories of the Byzantine liturgy. And then he looks at that and he says, what good is it unless it brings you to conversion, to metanoia? I think that's kind of the spirit of the Syriac fathers, that to avoid all these other distractions, it's you and your relationship with God. It's the community and the relationship with God.
Yes. There's, in the letters of Barsanuphius and John, there's a similar sort of thing where a monk writes and says, hey, one of the brothers may be a heretic. Should I refute him? And they say, no, be quiet. And he says, well, what if he says this? No, be quiet. Well, what if he says that? I can't remember how many different, they keep writing back with, well, what about this? And it's like, no, stay in your stillness. Don't let, if the heresy pulls you out of your stillness, then the heresy has won.
Good insights.
Kind of two questions, or maybe one with a follow-up. The 7th century paradise of Anisha. I have looked at it because we're doing with the saints.
Yeah, please mention to everyone this Maronite translation or edition that you were telling me about.
Yeah. Well, I did look up on it again because
Right.
it was bothering me last night. with regard to Germanus Farhat. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, here.
I was mentioning to the professor yesterday that in doing some of the research with the calendar, I was looking up about Synesius of Cyrene, the one that should not be on our calendar because of some heretical statements in the past and his beliefs. But he got included due to Germanus Farhat, one of our bishops who was the bishop of Aleppo at the time, and he was a monk. And but he has this entry in his Synaxarion, and I ended up finding, I thought when I was talking to you yesterday that it was from the Paradise, which he did take things sometimes from the Paradise, because Germanus Farhat did translate this Paradise document into Arabic. He did a lot of translating of different things, especially a lot of the Latin works into Arabic. But the document that for that one was John, I can't pronounce his last name, Mosicus.
Moscus, yeah.
Moscus, what is it? The Practicum Spirituale.
Yeah, the spiritual meadow.
Right, the spiritual meadow. That's where that story of Synesius comes
okay.
from. But it's the same kind of idea from the Desert Fathers. But I guess my question was, with regard to this S1, the common, would Anisho be part of that? Would it be the S1 recension? And then Dadisho's commentary on it is reflecting then, of course, on the S1 version. Do you know, I know Budges obviously exists over the Paradise, but has anyone translated Dadisho's commentary on the Paradise?
Perfect question. At this point, you've just forced me to reveal that I have no original ideas. So when I was writing my dissertation on Philoxenos, Bob Kitchen was translating Philoxenos discourses. When I was writing my book on Dadisho, Bob Kitchen is translating Dadisho's commentary into English. So, Bob, if you're watching this, I couldn't have done my work without your translations. It hasn't been published yet. There is a French edition and translation that's coming out in Source Chrétien, which also should be applauded because Source Chrétien has now begun including the Syriac text along with the translation by David Phillips. And the first volume of that just came out this fall, and I think all 3 volumes will come out within the next year. So actually we're in terrific shape. We'll have, for the first time, the first Syriac edition, and then English translation by Bob Kitchen and French translation by David Phillips. And there is also a English translation of the Ethiopic, which is by Bob Kitchen. And I believe there's an English translation of one of the Arabic versions by Mario Koza. So having said that, there is not, I'm aware of, any single study on the work. You know, I have a chapter on it. Bob Kitchen has a few articles on it. But, you know, for something that I think we'll soon realize had a role in medieval Syriac monasticism similar to the Philokalia does in the Greek and Slavic tradition, that's really a terrific area. So if anyone here is looking for a dissertation topic, you know, actually the real topic would be nobody since Budge has tried to edit and translate the Paradise itself. You can understand why.
Yeah, but that would be nice because it needs a modern edition.
One, it needs a modern edition, and 2, the manuscript that Budge used disappeared. So we need, you know, we need like a critical edition. Budge just used one. It's just sort of a funny story. An English socialite, sort of, you know, wealthy socialite randomly collected the Eastern manuscripts, and Budge persuaded her to let him publish a deluxe edition of this. Thank you. Other questions? Father Bijani.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor. To me, in all my research, it's good to have someone like yourself who not only has been working in all these areas, but doing it in an ecumenical way. I really appreciate that. yesterday I made some comments about Evagrius, and I'm just curious because I just wonder in your readings whether you have any ideas about what happens with the rest of Evagrius's trilogy. Because as you know, he not only talks about contemplating the death and judgment and divine providence, and then of course contemplating the material world, but then he talks about contemplating the spiritual world, which I guess has to do with angels and so forth. But I've never seen anything about that whole area. Did the Syriac writers give up on that, or was that?
Too speculative.
And then of course, as you mentioned, Theologia, and I'm very fascinated with that because I know he was influenced by Origen and so forth, and he does. At least from what I've read, talks about a real mystical kind of experience, but it's the commentators have said it is more of an intellectual one, the nous gymnos, rather than what you find in the other Syriac writers, which is very ecstatic. Do you have any ideas about that? What you think about it, and how does it influence the Syriac writers?
Those are really terrific questions. And just for everyone else's point of reference, so, as I mentioned, for Evagrius in the Greek versions, there's actually a sort of double creation, double fall, double redemption. And so that last second redemption, which seems to be something extra biblical, is this idea of a naked or disembodied mind that then comes to contemplate God or encounter God in some way. And the S1 tradition edits that out completely. So the S1 tradition really collapses all of that down just to a language of divine vision and is actually reluctant to put anything more on that. If we had to say what vocabulary arises uniquely in the Syriac tradition, it might be what Sebastian Brock has written about is a language of spiritual inebriation or spiritual drunkenness. So there are a number of authors. I have a little section on this in my book and can draw on Sebastian Brock's already work on it, where this ecstatic state is, the language used is sort of drunk with the love of God. Of course, it's drawing on Paul's words, to be drunk with the Spirit rather than wine. So, yes, definitely the Syriac authors are intentionally editing that out. And when they do want to give something, they use that. It is really interesting. Remember, I mentioned this constant refrain of when the presence of God comes to you, stop reading. So, don't keep reading and miss the presence of God. There's a text by Abraham of Nathmar that also gives rules for reading. And one of the rules is, don't read while drunk. And so when I first came to it, I thought, okay, well, probably good advice for the monk. But the more I looked at it in the context, he means don't read when you're drunk with the Spirit. Which, of course, also should be obvious, but given our proclivities as human beings, as someone who's paid to read for a living, I do often, feel like, oh no, I'm reading these spiritual texts so fast I can't benefit from them. I'm just reading them to get my work done. So I think that's really the legacy that happens. Thank you. Yes, Your Grace.
I think that the whole emphasis of the last couple of days is that the Syriac tradition really takes a sober look at how the person encounters God. And that nothing, even philosophical or spiritual things, should get in the way of that. And it seems like that's one of the great offerings of the Syriac Church. Ecumenically, East and West, Miaphysite, Diaphysite, the varieties of that.
I would agree strongly. Something that I find that resonates with me as a Protestant even is we find in Philoxenos and in the Syriac Evagrian tradition an emphasis on God's presence is going to come through God's action. At best, you're preparing yourself to be open to an encounter with God, which is in many ways very similar to, you know, a sort of Protestant approach to encountering God. And someone like Philoxenos' concern is, okay, if you're too busy parsing your verb paradigm, exegeting what this word in Scripture is, then your mind is closed off, and it's if you're God might be trying to encounter you, but you're not looking up from the page. Thank you.
Wonderful.